Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you today.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing fine.
Good.
We want to talk about what's going on in the Senate. There's going to be a vote tomorrow in the Senate, maybe tomorrow, the next day. The big issue is Iran and whether or not the president has authority to go to war just when he wants to, or bomb if he wants to, or whatever, and he has no responsibility to go to the Congress. But the one leading the charge on that attitude, of course, would be Pompeo and Bolton. Bolton. So they're very adamant about it, that the executive branch has complete authority over war. And Trump is not bashful about it either, but they're trying to get a vote up to amend it and say that you must come to the Congress to get authority to go to war against Iran. And that's where the resistance is. But as usual, they're playing games, and it looks like they're not going to permit the amendment. McConnell does not want to have that amendment come up. And there's matter of fact, he probably has bipartisan support for this, but still the resistance to going to war without a declaration has it's a popular appeal to a lot of people, and therefore they don't even want to have a vote on this. So right now, there's a big argument going on because if the vote will mean, are they going to vote to permit the debate and go on and not allow the amendment to be issued, which is a setback for those of us who believe that the Congress does deserve a say on this, and Congress should give permission rather than giving this power. If they don't have this amendment, it means it acknowledges the fact of what these guys are saying, that the executive branch doesn't have to pay any attention. Unfortunately, that attitude has been around for a long time, and it keeps getting worse when you look at everything from Korea on, except the Senate has stood up to this more so than in the past, because the Yemen vote was an indication that people are getting tired of this. So this will be an interesting vote, but there will be a lot of politics involved in this, maneuvering, and they can't do anything just on the issue, because if they did, they would just say, well, why don't we just read the Constitution, find out what we're allowed to do? But no, that isn't it. It has to be politicized. It has to be a big deal. And tomorrow might be an important day on what's happening over the Iranian issue.
And the bill is, of course, the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. And at issue is this amendment that was introduced with bipartisan support, including a senator that we both know from Kentucky who supports it, which simply says that there is funding is disallowed to do anything against Iran without a congressional authorization. Should be a no-brainer, really. But the issue is whether to add this amendment to the Senate version of the NDAA, which of course passed in the House last week. They're trying to block this is the thing that's interesting when we first started talking about this topic, Dr. Paul. 600 amendments have been shut out from the bill. They just don't want to have any amendments, and it reminds me, back when you were in the House, that was really the only way that a member that didn't have a lot of power and authority, who was equal to every other member, they've been elected by as many people, he was able to get things through, at least get a debate on things. So blocking 600 amendments is shocking. It's really the concentration of power in the leadership. But the issue is whether the Democrats can pull together 41 votes to stop McConnell from pushing this thing through without the amendment.
In a way, there may be some good news in this whole issue right now, because usually this is a bill that is held in high esteem, and there's tremendous bipartisan support for the military appropriations.
Yeah.
But it's never been held up. There's never been a lost vote on this bill in 60 years.
It's amazing.
And remember, when I would be voting against a bill like this for various reasons, and one being that I didn't think it helped national security.
Yeah.
But anyway, there was always a handful At one time early on, there were like 10 or 12 of us, and very rarely there'd be one or two other Republicans and then some Democrats. And then gradually those numbers increased. When I left, we were making progress, maybe 30 or 40.
Should have stayed in.
This is a big deal in that it's always shoved through, and it also makes my point that on the big issues, strong bipartisanship, support for the wars, support for the financing of the war, support for the Federal Reserve that finances these wars. It's always bipartisan, and they don't want to deal with this. So I think the fact that there's a little bit of argument going on here is a pretty good idea.
And as we talked before, this is a lot more about politics than anything else. And this is an oversimplification, but what I jotted down here is here's the political risk I think that both parties are looking at. The Democrats, the political risk they're looking at is blocking funding for the troops, and that's what the propaganda will be. On the Republican side, you're keeping our troops from having their meal and that sort of thing, versus the Republicans blocking debate on whether the president can go to war without constitutional authority. Those are the two balancing political risks. And then you have to sprinkle on top of it all the goodies that are going to each individual district, all these projects, all the bacon that they're bringing home. Most of it is completely unrelated to our defense. So that's, I think, the scorecard there.
I think this is good. I think they should put the prohibition on. But it isn't the end of the story, because when the desire is so strong, they just go around. They go around the Constitution. Why wouldn't they go around this and find, funding some other way? And it just reminds me of 82 to 84. There were 3 times they passed the Bolin Amendment, because the big issue then was whether or not we should be spending money in fighting the Contras and giving money to the Contras. And it always passed. It was not only the Constitution prohibition without permission. The Congress then comes along and say explicitly don't do it, and everybody knows the scandal that occurred. After that, they did it secretly. So if they don't have respect for the Constitution to begin with, and then they do this Mickey Mousing around, it still is important that the votes go through to call attention to them. That there is something very old-fashioned about what we're talking about, and that is the presidency versus the Congress.
Yeah.
Executive privilege, the strong executive. What does the Congress have? What's their responsibility? Of course, we believe that, and the Constitution says, they have really the ultimate responsibility for declaring war. And then if they go and do this mischief, you deny them the funding, which they worked on in Yemen, and now they're working on this, and they did it in the 80s. But that still isn't it. It still is something a little bit more difficult to define, because it has to do with character, beliefs, and the morality of it all, because it seems like the world isn't made up of Pompeos and Bolton. But I tell you what, they have a lot of influence, and a lot of people agree with that, and a lot of people can be convinced of that. So therefore, the restraints on promoting war and funding of war, is something that they always said. That actually is what finally ended the Vietnam War, stopped the funding. But that also, you introduced the factor of what are the people thinking about, and I think if you did a poll, or if we have a poll, maybe the people don't want a war with Iran.
Yeah, I think that is the issue. The numbers are there, and we have actually a poll that was just conducted by Hill Harris. It was released on the 23rd. Some super important numbers on this. Less than 25% of Americans polled want to take military action against Iran. That's significant. 58% of Americans prefer a non-military solution. 19% are unsure. Hopefully those 19% are watching the show right now. And this is significant. 50% of Republicans said they prefer a peaceful response, despite the constant propaganda of Iran attacking us. Half of all Republicans, if Trump is not looking at those numbers, then he's crazy.
I've often said that if you're running in a campaign, in a presidential race, the peace candidate generally does very well. And I think, with Obama's record and Trump's independence, he came across as the peace candidate. even if he didn't win the Nobel Prize. Yeah, so, but he was the peace candidate and argues the case. He still says things that, will bring us into his camp, just like by backing off on the bombing that he backed off on. But it still doesn't answer all the questions, because policies are important, and the point we worked hard at trying to make yesterday is that the things that lead up to war are important too, and putting on sanctions are one way of doing that we have to take into consideration.
And let's not forget the power of the mainstream media that still remains, because as much as we like those numbers, they could flip tomorrow if the media decides on a narrative that gets people riled up. And here's an interesting contrast in a way, and this is, and I know you don't like to name names, but The Hill did, so I can quote it. But Mr. Imhoff, Senator Imhoff from Oklahoma, this is his view on just having a vote on an amendment, telling the president, you got to come and get authorization. He said, I'd like it to not get a vote. He calls it a political consideration. To toss the Constitution into the trash like that is pretty amazing. And I don't want to sound partisan here too, and I believe it was Tim Kaine, I didn't write it down. I thought this was a pretty good quote, because you remember, it was about 10 minutes away from launching those strikes on Iran. And here's the quote, I think that justifies a vote. Considering how close the U.S. was to attacking Iran without authorization 10 minutes away, it's bizarre that the Senate doesn't even want to talk about it.
Schumer had an interesting reason why they should delay it, and that has to do with the Democrat, debates going on. We should at least wait till the debates are over. And I think he sort of alluded to the fact, well, we want everybody to be there, and nobody can be, absent. But there's also that, this bipartisanship, and that we can delay it. But I don't think that he is exactly in our camp, because the Democrats have been every bit as bad as the hawkish Republicans. And right now, the so-called hawkish Republicans, if you exclude a couple of appointees, they probably are better than what our previous president did, because he was the one that started a war in Syria, or put us into that war. So this is a thing that we might argue, well, there's not a new war started so far, but boy, there sure have been a lot of agitation. And when you think about how you can even talk about Saudi Arabia in this deal, that and Yemen and our support for that, there's very much support for war. Just think, if the non-interventionists, if our side had been in charge, or were in charge, what would this NDAA budget be like? It would be reduced to not a military budget. It would be reduced to being a defense budget.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be that tough to defend this country. When you consider, if you don't have to have troops in 150 countries bankrupting everybody and making enemies, I think it would be a lot easier and a lot better for our country.
You could probably drop a few zeros from the end of that amount of money they're passing. Of course, then you'd have an ocean of tears all along the Beltway, having to give up their mansions that they make on the back of this. The other note that unfortunately is also not being debated in the Senate was that the House was able to scrape enough votes up to repeal the authorization for the use of military force, the 9/11 authorization, which is significant because that's what the Trump administration has claimed, or is at least attempting to rather tenuously claim, gives it authority to attack Iran. So that unfortunately is not being debated in the Senate, which should be. Perhaps when the two bills are passed and they go to conference, it'll come up. But I don't think either of us is very confident that the Senate would adopt that in the final conference report.
No, a lot of attitudes have to be changed. For us to win, we have to expose, and the people have to reject the power of the military-industrial complex. And that's where it really comes from. And it is very nonpartisan. They support anybody and everybody that they can control. And that's why it's bipartisan. They end up controlling both parties. And that's what has to be conquered someday. But that isn't going to be taken care of. Instincts are good. That poll you just quoted, those are the instincts. And that's the way the people think. But then, and you frequently bring it up about the media. The media has controlled the propaganda. And this changes his people's attitude. It was so dramatic leading up to the Iraq War because it wasn't immediate after 9/11. They waited. It was almost a year of propagandizing because the people didn't want it, and yet they went along with it because they listened to the lies. And now hardly anybody believes that we went to war without being told lies. You know, we were lied into that war. People recognize that. And even a person like Bolton, who was part of that thing, defends his position on that. You know,
still.
he sort of gets upset if somebody brings that up. You don't know what you're talking about. You know, but he defends that position that it was good for our country. Got rid of that bad guy.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know, there's a real discrepancy here between, and I think the president, he's got to understand this. He said over the weekend, yeah, if Bolton has his way, we'd be at war with everyone in the whole rest of the world at once. Yeah, that's pretty serious. And I hope that the president, when he has that in his mind, when he looks at these polls and understands that right now the Americans don't want war, you're risking your reelection when you've got half of your own party saying don't go to war with Iran. You're at risk here in a big way. So hopefully the president understands this. We understand this, of course. And again, I'll tell you that we are going to be debating this and discussing this with some terrific speakers at our August 24th conference in Washington, D.C., the Belly of the Beast, the Heart of Mordor. We're going to bring the show on the road. You know, we're having early bird tickets up until around July 10th, I think it is. Why do we offer a discount? Because we haven't announced the names of the speakers. We're basically asking you to take a risk that we're going to have good speakers, and we haven't had them every time. So you're taking a small risk and saving some money, and you're going to enjoy yourself. We're going to start announcing speakers, but get your tickets right away. Get there. We're, Dr. Paul, I think over a third sold. We haven't sold them this quickly. Usually people wait toward the end to see their schedule. It's selling out quickly, so we're looking forward to seeing you there. All of these issues are really at the forefront.
Very good, and I endorse that wholly. You know, the diplomacy issue, I want to talk about that a minute because we put on sanctions and it turned out they were going to sanction the Ayatollah. And probably in a practical sense doesn't do a whole lot. In an emotional and supportive sense, this probably riled the Iranians up more than anything. And that answer is the Ayatollah said diplomacy has been closed forever. Others have tried to tone that down a little bit, but you can understand that if you understand a little bit about their culture, and it has no value whatsoever, and it leads to these conflicts and why they're so important. But you know, the one thing that Pompeo wants to do, and he's marching around the world now, is to try to copy George H.W. Bush. He's looking for the coalition of the willing, and bring them together, bring 100 countries together, sort of like they tried in Venezuela. The coalition didn't work too well there. They had all these nations, 26 nations in South America, but it didn't work. But you know what I'm worried about? Is that there will be a coalition, and they're going to have a coalition of the willing. And if we keep doing what we're doing, it's going to be a coalition of the willing against us and not with us to fight these wars. That's what we ought to be concerned about. We're not in a position that we should continue this foreign policy. We can't afford it. It doesn't work. And believe me, the coalition against us is building. So the sooner we wake up, the better. And the answers aren't difficult. There's a lot of legislation that's been passed to try to restrain the executive branch. But what we need are more people who say, well, the information and our guideline is in the Constitution, so why not obey it? We would be fighting a lot less wars if we did. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.